Before exploring Greek temples, I want to talk about the typical Greek temple plan, their structures, their decoration, and their use. Now, many of the earliest structures do not survive because they were wood and mud brick. However, by the time we get to the Archaic and later, the Greek temples begin to be made of stone. And I should point out that this is primarily in the metropolitan areas, in the wealthier areas. If you get out into the outskirts or up into the Balkans where there's some Greek influence, etc., they may be building with mud brick and wood, and we don't have those temples. Greece is not a great place to use those materials and have them survive. So typically these are going to be limestone or marble whenever they're available, marble being fairly available in ancient Greece. And we will see different colored marbles on occasion from different quarries. And really, these are different values of white typically. That's what you generally see in ancient Greece, although we may see other examples. Now, the temple would house a cult statue of the deity, and this was seen as the grandest of the votive offering. But the temple itself is an offering to the god, much like the Apollo that we looked at. This is the Greek people making an offering to the god so that the god will sort of owe them one, hopefully a big one because it's a big, impressive temple. In terms of floor plan, in the center we have the cella, in Greek the naos, but I'm going to stick with the term cella because that's what we've been working with. This is the sanctum sanctorum. Only the priests can enter into the cella. You would never enter into it as a common person, a holdover that we're seeing from the ancient world. The whole thing, I'm not going to worry about the pronaos, etc., but the pronaos is the entrance. The whole thing sits on the stylobate, which is the level of marble that the columns in the cella sit on. Surrounding the cella, we have a colonnade, which is the space between our columns and the cella. And then the whole thing is built on what's called a stereobate, which is basically a foundation that would run around it. I'm not going to ask you to memorize all of these terms. I need you to be familiar with them, but you don't need to memorize them. So when we look at this temple, in the center you would have, and this is sort of a generic Greek temple, in the center you would have our cult statue. This would be a massive statue. It would have some kind of fence or guardrail around it to make sure no one goes in there except the highest of the priests. The priests could enter, but at the end of the day, you do not. Those doors would have been open though, so that you could look in and see the cult statue if you wanted to offer it a prayer, etc. The whole thing would be incredibly ornate and would be painted, but we'll get to that. Now we have two styles of temples during this period. We're going to see Doric and Ionic. The Ionic order, that form of temple, starts in the Ionian colonies, in other words, Turkey. The Doric order is said to come from primarily southern Italy and come over into Greece, or it's argued that it comes from northern Greece and comes down into the south, into the more well-known city-states. Either way, it's not coming from Athens, Sparta, etc. These are outside influences coming in once again. The Doric and the Ionic, there's a couple of things you can look at that really set them apart. So, for example, the Doric uses a triglyph and metope. So, a metope is basically just a simple image. And then the next one would be another image. And these metopes work like comic books. But the thing you want to look at and focus on if you're looking at orders is look at the column. If it has a Doric column, then it's Doric order. If it has an Ionic column, let's go back, then it is an Ionic order temple. The other difference is instead of metopes, the Ionic has a frieze, which would be one continuous long image running around the building. Now, these columns, there are three types. These are known as the Greek orders. There's the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. The Doric and Ionic exist during the Archaic period through the Classical period. The Corinthian over here, I'm just going to borrow that line, that comes later. That's from the Hellenistic. So that's going to be a development. It's showing some Persian influence as we get into it. It's similar to things that we saw at Persepolis and elsewhere, and it's argued back and forth who influenced who, but at the end of the day, that is a later column. I will not make you memorize these columns, but it is a good idea to be familiar with them. Really, the Doric is the simplest. The Ionic has that that scroll at the top, which is just two-sided. So if you see it from the outside here, it's just rolled over. On these sides, you see the scroll, and we see the use of a base. And then the Corinthian is the same all around. It's a symmetrical capital, so very ornate capital, and then we see a base. And those bases can change a little bit, but we don't worry about those changes too much, especially at this level. Those capitals serve a function, which is to take you from the vertical of the column to the horizontal of the roof line above it. And so what they're doing is basically creating something that acts as a transition. The Ionic is doing effectively the same thing, creating that transition the same way the Doric does. So they're always trying to transition the eye from the vertical to the horizontal. That's the function of those capitals. In terms of proportion, things change over time. The Greek insistence on proportional order guided early experiments with temple plans. Early temples have a 1:3 proportion, looking at ends to side. So if you look at number 2 there, you see that that is a very long, thin temple. And as time progresses, they get shorter and wider. This is because they're moving away from a 1:3, this very long proportion, to a 1:3 proportion, to a 1:2 proportion, which is incredibly similar to the human form, which has a proportion of 1.618 to 1, and the Greeks would have been quite familiar with it by the time we get to the classical, which is when these proportions are really getting close to that human proportion. By the way, that proportion describes the length of the bones in your fingers, the length of the hand to the forearm, the length to width of, or height to width of the face, the eyes, the nose, etc. It is used throughout the human body. So why not create a temple that reflects this form that is created in the image of the gods? Thus, let's apply the human proportion as much as we can to the temple. Proportion architecture reflected and embodied the cosmic order according to the Greeks. Now let's talk about the function. When you go to a temple, the altar is actually outside. Again, no one goes inside the temple except for the priests, and then only on specific occasions. They aren't hanging out inside the cella. The altar is where you would offer a sacrifice. If you were quite poor, it might be some kind of bird. If you were wealthier, it might be a bull. It changes based on what you do. And when you made that offering, what would happen is they would burn part of that offering. They would sacrifice the animal and burn part of it on the altar. The rest of it would be split between the priesthood and the people bringing it. So if you bring an oxen, you're not giving an entire oxen away. You're going to walk away with a certain portion of the ox. The priesthood, which has effectively a vow of poverty, you can kind of think of it that way, will eat the other part because that's how they survive. As a patron, if you're going to the temple, you would generally gather outside to see these sacrifices, to pray if you're going to, etc. The temple itself houses the cult statue. Now, while the temple is an offering to the god, the cult statue is the ultimate offering to the god. They do have some belief, or some Greeks have the belief, that this statue could actually come to life and speak to you. The god could speak to you through the statue, something we see in Hercules, the movie. However, that's not the common belief. Most Greeks at this time are kind of with the gods. Like, they'll use them when they need it. Hey, I need help with this. I need help with that. I'm going to pray to the gods. But for the most part, they're not worried about these massive state gods. They understand that they are identification. In other words, the god you pray to really speaks to who you are, what city-state you belong to, etc. So They will pray to their domestic gods, the ones that exist in a shrine in their home, but we aren't going to see them going to these temples all the time. The temple itself is seen as an offering to the god, also a house for the god, not that the god is there all the time, but that the god could appear there at any time. So they have to be prepared for that. The building itself was conceived of as sculpture. It's meant to evoke a human response, much like churches today. And its inspiring function in public life, emphasized by elevation. In other words, these temples are always very tall. They're always on a mound or a hill so that everyone can see it. It's a constant reminder of your identity, of who you are. Now, mind you, I didn't say anything about morals and ethics because that is not part of religion at this time. That is coming primarily from philosophy. The outside would be covered in sculpture. By the way, all the sculpture would have been painted and very gaudily. We'll get there again. These are embellishments, but they also tell stories about the god that this temple is devoted to. And we see the same thing today in many religious structures. For example, Catholic churches with their stained glass windows that might focus on the stories of the life of the person that the church is dedicated to. This becomes a tactile offering to the god as well as a way to teach the people the morals of these stories. These stories pass down taboos, mores, sort of social rules, the sort of thing that we don't often talk about openly, but hopefully your parents said something about. Like, hey, if you're 30 years old, you can't throw a tantrum in the grocery store, people are going to look at you a little weird. These stories would come out in these pieces, and then there's metaphors and everything else that go into it. In terms of color, these were gaudily painted. In fact, there are many reconstructions, many thoughts that, in fact, the columns were painted as well as the exterior of the cella, all of the sculpture, all of those details of the architecture would have been painted. Why? Because if it's all white, well, you're not going to see anything. It's going to lack detail. They want people to really clearly see what the stories are, what the images are, and so they're going to paint them. Much like a Victorian house, they also use color to set off the various architectural details that exist within the temple. So this sets off figures and details. It would be considered gaudy today, but it avoids the Egyptian over-ornamentation. So it is getting a little less gaudy. That being said, you will see really bright temples if you were alive in ancient Greece. None of these would have been white, and they would have been painted on a regular basis because these are water-based paints, and so it's going to need to be repaired regularly. And again, the reason we don't find them is because some of the paint has worn off, and other times the dealers or the people who found it went ahead and scraped it off to make it more beautiful and easier to sell.